art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven.
Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.
Saint Monica,
Pray for us.
Okay, so let's go to the vertical handout, and we were reading about this. We're reading De Filius, so we're up to chapter 4, and so this is tying in with the three wisdoms, right? And so remember, De Filius, it's definitely arguing against fideism, the idea that you can only know about God based on faith. But at the same time, it's arguing against the opposite extreme, which is rationalism. Because, right, there was a lot of philosophers saying that faith is a superstition. You should only know about God based on reason. So those are the two extremes. And so against the rationalists, they're going to say, well, no, there are mysteries about God that reason can't understand. But then against fideists, they're going to say, well, but on the other hand, there's reason can understand the preambles. They don't use the word preambles, but you can see that's the idea. And as I mentioned, it says compare Constantino's book 1, chapter 4. I mean, it's almost basically word for word quoting Aquinas there in that paragraph. Okay, so chapter 4. I guess Eric, do you want to start? On the vertical handout.
Says therefore?
The Catholic Church, with one consent, is about the middle of the page.
The Catholic Church,
I could hold it up. But
The Catholic Church, with one consent, has also ever held and does hold that there is a twofold order of knowledge, distinct both in principle and also in object. In principle, because our knowledge in the one is by natural reason, and in the other is by divine faith. In object, because besides those things to which natural reason can attain, there are proposed for our belief mysteries hidden in God, which, unless divinely revealed, cannot be known.
Right, so this is straight from Aquinas, right? Now I say that because, right, in the Middle Ages or before Aquinas, right, the fathers and doctors of the church were not always, they had different takes on this when it came to the details. And some of them might have sounded more kind of fideistic. And those are like Augustine, for example, we're going to come back to that next semester. But with Augustine, sometimes he might sound fideistic. And that's the kind of text that Luther and Calvin would pick up on. But there's other texts where he says, no, you can know about God based on reason. So in his book, The City of God, he explicitly says that Plato knew about God based on reason. But someone like Luther is going to completely ignore the text in The City of God, book 8, where he says that you can know about God based on reason, like the example of Plato, and he's only going to focus on, let's say, a text like Confessions of book 7, where he says, the philosophers are being led by the devil. Well, when he says that, he's talking about philosophers who were attacking Christianity, right? Because that's the context for Augustine. With Aquinas, there's no, even if there are philosophers attacking Christianity, Aquinas is still making a distinction and saying, well, that's a misuse of philosophy, right? But that doesn't take away the fact that some philosophers did discover the truth about God. Whereas Augustine is being polemical, right? Because it's at a point in history when, many people are still, the mythology book, they still take that seriously, right? They're still following the pagan religion, and there's a battle kind of going on for which religion is going to become predominant in the Roman Empire, and he wants to show people, look, which of course is true, that's a bunch of fairy tales, right? The mythology, none of that is real. It's nice little stories for children, right? So in the course of that, then when you have philosophers like you would never, Celsus is one of them. I mean, was he a philosopher? He's not really. You wouldn't find him in any philosophy textbook, but he was certainly appealing to reason, saying that Christianity doesn't make sense, and so on and so forth. Attacking Christianity, right? So that's the context for him saying that. He's talking about Celsus, who wrote, a book against the Christians, when he says that the philosophers are led by the devil. He's not talking about Plato, because he himself acknowledges, he says in book City of God, it's actually in the vertical handout later on, I give you that quote. that Plato was the philosopher who was closest to Christianity. Okay, so see how Luther and Calvin are going to misuse Augustine. So this is why they're turning to Aquinas and basically enshrining Aquinas' view as Catholic dogma, right? Not the view of Augustine, because with Augustine, it's not really clear. He doesn't really make any distinctions. Sometimes he's attacking Greek philosophy. Other times he's saying, we depend on them a lot. But he never really came up with a solution to that at that point in history, in 400 AD. And then Aquinas is really the one, kind of the first one to really do the best job of showing the harmony between faith and reason in a systematic way, which really hadn't been done before to that point. And then, of course, this is 600 years after Aquinas. So even then, there was maybe more leeway on this within Catholicism, where you could be like, well, maybe I agree more with, someone who's more downplaying the role of reason with regards to God, right? But here, this is an ecumenical council, which is the highest authority in the church, right? Council meeting with the Pope. So that just giving you the background of this. And you see how often things are complicated, historically speaking. Like something that we take for granted, well, prior to 1870, we take the Immaculate Conception for granted. Prior to 1854, you could have said, no, that's right. Not really, or the account of it could have been different. Like, well, maybe she was conceived immaculate right after she was conceived, but not in the moment of her conception. Right? You had the freedom to say that. So that's the development of dogma, when you have like an ex cathedra statement that fulfills, there's about a half a dozen or a dozen criteria that it has to fulfill that are in Vatican I. The assumption, same thing. Prior to 1950, you could say, I don't really agree with that, but that changed after 1950. Okay, but so if you're reading historical texts, you have to keep that in mind. Like if you're reading some author from before this, they might be very minimal about reason knowing about God, or maybe they'll say, reason can't know about God, it's too far. Well, after Luther, then they realized we need to hammer this out, and then here they just made it a dogma. You have to say, to see how it works. So you have to be careful, because if you're reading someone from, 400 or 1200 or 1600, they might say, reason can't really know God. Well, after Luther, they said, no, we need to make clear reason can know God. So you have to be careful with doing historical theology, as it were, right? If you're dealing with the dogma, right, like this. It's clear from Canon 2, which is the last thing we'll read. Because, of course, not everything, right, is going to be dogmatic. It's said in a council. Okay, who's next?
But although faith is above reason, there can never be any real discrepancy between faith and reason, since the same God who reveals mysteries and infuses faith has bestowed the light of reason on the human mind. And God cannot deny himself, nor can truth ever contradict truth. This counters the claim that the God grasped by natural reason, by Socrates, Plato, etc., is not the God of faith.
So I might as well go into this because this is an important topic. So Pascal, right, talking about quoting people. They're like, oh no, Pascal is a great Catholic philosopher, right? Let's quote Pascal. Well, Pascal also was a Jansenist. Now, right, and I think apparently, I haven't really looked into the details that much, apparently he reconciled with the church, but Jansenism was condemned as a heresy. And it was a whole big drama in France at the time. But he sided with the Jansenists, right? And the Jansenists are Fideists. Easy way to understand, right? Have I mentioned that? Jansenism is Calvinism for Catholics.
Well, that's the best thing I've ever heard.
Ironically, the Protestant rebellion, right? Even though it's against Catholicism, it still influenced Catholicism in some sectors, and that's Jansenism. Like they thought, well, yeah, it's true. Augustine did say in the Confessions that the leader of the philosophers is the devil. So yeah, the philosophy is bad. You see. Well, what about City of God? Oh, well, they don't know about the City of God. They're not looking at that text. They've forgotten about that text. They haven't. You see what I'm saying? That's how it is with especially really with the fathers of the church, right? You can cherry pick kind of whatever you want from some of the fathers of the church because they're not systematic. It's not like Thomas, where you can see just from the we've read how systematic and orderly he is. In one letter they say one thing, another letter they say another thing, right? it took really 1,000 years for theology, to start to become systematic. So Jansenism is Calvinism for Catholics, even though that might sound surprising to you, right? That's what was going on. So you have to be careful. Think, oh, the wonderful Pascal, and let's love Pascal. Well, wait a minute. We tend to forget. Let's not forget he was a Jansenist. See, when I talk about both historical theology and historical philosophy, right? Being aware, you have to be kind of aware of who you're dealing with. So he has this. You might have heard of it, right? This famous thing where he had this he says it was a kind of mystical experience, and one thing he says is. Right, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, not of the philosophers and scholars. Right. So he says, right, the God of Abraham, right, not the God of philosophers. So do you see how that's kind of definitely reflecting his Jansenism, right? Because Calvinism is fideistic, correct? Calvin and Luther are both fideists. Calvin a tiny bit less, but still, no, he's still a fideist, even if he doesn't use a strong language. And you can see that influencing Pascal, right? Blaise Pascal. So Blaise Pascal is good in a lot of ways. He's an anti-Cartesian, which is very nice. But just because he's right in criticizing Descartes and Barry's point doesn't mean we should just follow Pascal as if he's the sort of. Just because he claimed to have this mystical vision doesn't necessarily mean that, right? Pseudo-mysticism can be the source of all kinds of error through the whole history of the church. So he says that God of Abraham, not the God of philosophers. And so this is what I would call a false opposition, right? Where you either have, the God of Christianity, or you have the God of philosophy. Like they're not the same thing, right? And really, there's all kinds of. These terms are ambiguous, right? When you say philosophers, that's an ambiguous term, right? Who do you mean when you say not the God of philosophers? So, what you have to do when there's something ambiguous is you want to disambiguate. So what exactly are we talking about here? So if you're saying the God of Abraham is not the God of Spinoza, who's a pantheist, well then, that's true, right? T stands for true. Right? Because, yes, Spinoza is a pantheist, and he called himself a philosopher. That's not the God of Abraham, 100%, right? But he's not saying the God of Abraham, not the God of Spinoza. He's just saying the God of Abraham, not the God of philosophers. So this has kind of become a phrase that people will quote. They'll say, well, the God of philosophers, in a dismissive way. Like, oh, the God of philosophers, that's not the real God. So, all right, if you're talking about Spinoza, that's true. But what if you're talking about, I don't know, was Socrates a philosopher? I think so, right? He's like the founder of like Western philosophy. Is that true? That now even there though, how do we make a distinction? What distinction do we want to make? So is the God of Abraham the God of Socrates, or is the God of the New Testament the God of Socrates?
Yes.
Okay.
But what we can know about God based on Socratic Socrates and based on Abraham is different.
Exactly. So that's where that distinction can become important. Because then if you say, so I say, yes, look, it's the same God. Oh, no, it's not. Did Socrates know about the Trinity? And then what do you have to answer there? What would Thomas Aquinas answer? You say, oh, no, the God of Socrates is not the God of Abraham because Socrates, his God is not a Trinity. Anybody?
Well, Abraham didn't necessarily know that.
Good, okay, that's true, yeah. He did. That's why I switched it to the gospel.
Socrates also didn't say, God is not a Trinity per se, but Socrates
Good.
was not able to.
He didn't deny it. It's not like, now, Islam, for example, explicitly denies the Trinity, right? It's an anti-Trinitarian religion. So, are we turning him into Muhammad here? Like he's denying the Trinity? He didn't even know about it. But, so if you want to say, right, the God of Jesus is not the God of Socrates, how is that true and how is that false? I mean, what's the distinction you can make?
One can know God by the preambles, using reason, and
Exactly.
he can gain access to God by revelation.
Exactly. So if we're talking about the preambles, it is the same God. And then the mysteries go beyond that. But he's not denying the mysteries. He just has so in that sense it's true that he has a more restricted view of God than the mysteries give, but it's still the same God, right? But this kind of thing is just very popular. amongst intellectuals. That, you know, the God of faith is not the God of philosophy. And it's actually, once again, it's true if we're talking about Spinoza, it's true if we're talking about, I mean, I don't know, any number of philosophers who have a distorted view of God, right? I don't know, John Stuart Mill, I'll give you a different example for variety, right? John Stuart Mill is a finitist, right? So Spinoza is a pantheist, as I mentioned. He's a finitist. It's called finite theism. He thinks God exists, but God is finite. God is not infinite. Right? God is limited. So can I say, therefore, that the God of John Stuart Mill, the God of that philosopher, is not the God of Abraham? Yes, because that's wrong. So, right, there's any number of distorted views of God, but the point is, was Aquinas aware of that when he wrote the Contra Gentiles? Of course he was. So the thing is, someone like, because he's being polemical, someone like Augustine is going to focus on all the ways the philosophers were wrong about God, right? Because he wants to get the Greco-Roman culture to become Christian. But if you think, but Aquinas, everyone's Christian. There's no need anymore to go on the warpath against philosophy, because everyone's Christian now. That's just a bunch of fairy tales, right? So rather, he's focusing on how philosophy is actually preparing for the gospel and the truth and the harmony between faith and reason, and how grace builds on nature, right? So for Aquinas, in contrast, right, there's the harmony between faith and reason, as opposed to this false opposition, with all the due distinctions like between preambles and mysteries, right? And another kind of aspect of that is just the idea that grace builds on nature. So, builds on nature. Right? So if the human reason is already Kappa Dei, then it makes sense that I can know more about God based on faith. Whereas in Luther, right, Fideism goes together with his view of total corruption of human nature. So Luther's, right, Fideism, Luther, right, his Fideism goes together with, or you could say it's a result of, like all the errors tie together, his idea of total corruption, right? As Catholics, we believe that human nature is partially corrupted by the effects of original sin, but he is very clear and extremely emphatic that we are totally corrupted. You might have heard of the snow-covered dunghill, right?
Yes.
So for him, human nature is a dunghill. It's utterly corrupted. There's nothing good in it. He actually says, this is condemned by the Council of Trent, he says, whatever human nature does of itself is a mortal sin. He says the only thing that human nature does of itself is to sin mortally. That's how utterly corrupt we are. And even when we have grace, that grace does not permeate us, it does not come within us, it just justifies us extrinsically. So that he compares the human justified by grace to a dunghill covered with snow. The snow doesn't make the dung white, it just covers it so God doesn't have to look at the ugliness. That is Luther's view of justification. That is not the Catholic view. It's also not the gospel view. So whenever I talk to Protestants, it doesn't happen often because even if I talk to them, they don't want to talk about their religion. That's how people are. But the rare occasion that it happens, right? This is not the problem with Protestants is it's against the gospel, right? Because Jesus did not prevent justification that way. He did not prevent grace that way. He did not present nature that way as totally corrupt, right? So do you see how those things tie together? So the problem is, like, when you say the God of Abraham is not the God of philosophers, it actually ties back to things like total corruption. It ties back to, all these other things, aspects of Calvinism. It ties in with the Hegel. So do you see? Do you see the harmony between faith and reason? It also goes along to a kind of harmony between grace and nature. Of course we're fallen. Of course it's difficult. In a sense, we were just talking about that last class, right? That's painfully obvious if you look around, right? We were talking about that. But still, there is good in human nature. And that's what grace builds on, you see? So you see how even your philosophy of how you view faith and reason, which is a philosophical question, right? That then can play out in how you view between grace and nature. Okay? So right, this opposition is only true if you take erroneous philosophers. So if you want to say not the God of erroneous philosophers, right, like John Stuart Mill and Spinoza. But he, just like Luther had, he's just lumping all philosophers together. They're all bad, they're all evil. And as much as we love St. Augustine, as much as we admire St. Augustine, he did at times write in a way that played into that. Remember, too, he was a new convert when he wrote his Confessions. So you see what I mean? You can also pick, that's another difference between Thomas and Augustine, right? He's a new convert. He's just gone from like sowing his wild oats, if you know. He had a 14-year-old son out of wedlock. We don't even know the name of the woman who he lived with. And then he just converted. He's on fire, as we'd say. And now he's like, you know, damn the philosophers. They work for the devil, you know. Spirit of that's still in Protestantism, right? And then Luther, but the thing about Luther is he's being selective, because then later on he's at the city guy's like, well, actually, you know, Plato and Christianity, they're actually pretty similar. Yeah, he's pretty much, he talks about God, and he knows that God is good. So in a calmer, more mature, right? So the other thing is you have to know who the authors you're talking about, right? Like Pascal was saying, or like Augustine, and what period, like right after his conversion, right? But then not just take one text from Augustine like Luther and Calvin did, you see what I mean? To distort Augustine, to not give a fair perspective. Okay? Since it's St. Monica's feast day, I figure
Tomorrow's Augustine.
Yeah, great. I mean, Augustine is wonderful, but see what I mean? It's helping me see the difference between Augustine and Aquinas. Aquinas, there's a maturity the church has reached, if you will. And the followers, it's kind of like the childhood of the church, with all the beauty of that as well, right? But also kind of some maybe confusions, right? Augustine would never say the philosophers live by the devil, because that's a sweeping statement. You follow by me? You want to avoid sweeping statements that don't make distinctions. Okay.
Does, with total corruption, does that not conflict with like how some Protestants view like double predestination, especially coming from Calvin and Luther at that time?
No. Of course, it fits together within their viewpoint. It fits together. Yeah, everyone is predestined to hell unless you're elect, and everyone's predestined to hell because they're totally corrupt. But we do not believe in predestination to hell. We only believe in predestination to heaven. We don't believe in double predestination. So yeah. I'm trying to think if we'll come back to that. Sometimes in the modern philosophy period, that's when Luther's usually covered more in detail, because he's like 1521. So, okay. So let's look. I think that's. But so you understand how it sounds really good at first. The God of Abraham is not the God of philosophers, of course, right? I mean, or the God of. But then now you guys know more, so you don't say of course, because Abraham didn't know about the Trinity, and he didn't know there was no incarnation yet. So if anything, Abraham kind of had a good natural philosophy. God is omnipotent, he's a creator, and he's provident. Well, you find that in the philosophers. So actually, it should be the God of Abraham is the God of a few philosophers. He is the God of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. You see? So you have to make a distinction, but instead, like a good Jansenist, he's just throwing out the baby with the bathwater, and well, apparently he converted on his deathbed, but that doesn't affect his writings, right? He converted after he wrote everything that he wrote. So you can't just be like, oh, Pascal was an anti-Cartesian Catholic. Hooray, Pascal. Let's just use Pascal for our, Okay. That harmony, or you could say complementarity. All right, so let's look at back to the text of the. This counters the claim that the God grasped by natural reason is not the God of faith. So, I mean, the claim, Pascal's claim, right? And it's who I was thinking of there, although it's obviously also in others. Okay, who's next?
And not only can faith and reason never be opposed to one another, but they're of mutual aid one to the other.
So see, you could kind of say, right, this is the if it was needed, even after Council of Trent, this is a condemnation of what Pascal's saying. Pascal's statement was condemned, in a sense, right? Faith and reason can never be opposed to each other. That sure looks like an opposition between faith and reason to me. If my eyes do not deceive me, right? But people don't always make those connections. They don't always connect the dots between like Vatican I, Aquinas, And Pascal, it's like, oh no, there's a perennial tradition. It includes Aquinas, it includes Pascal. Okay.
For right reason demonstrates the foundations of faith, the preambles of faith, and enlightened by its light, cultivates the science of divine things.
Notice scientific theology, right? Second wisdom. Oh, okay. Well, that language is there in Vatican I. So even though maybe you probably never heard of it, people don't really use it anymore. But still, it's in Vatican I. So it seems like we can talk about the science of theology. It's Thomas Aquinas uses it all the time, right? Because we have absolute certainty about the Trinity and so on as theologians. Huh?
Canons. Oh,
Sorry, Tyler, had a question.
So it seems like what Vatican I's saying here is like the mysteries are built on top of the preambles. And which
Exactly, right, foundations, yeah.
And that's why the, part of Revelation is the mysteries, but it also includes preambles. So in order that people who are not, skilled in philosophy, don't have time to study it, this, that, and the other, by being revealed the preambles, which are necessary to understand the mysteries.
Exactly. And right reason, that's from Aristotle, by the way. The expression right reason, recta ratio in Latin, orthos logos in Greek. That's from Aristotle's Enigma of Ethics. Because as I said, Aquinas is thoroughly Aristotelian, even though he integrates other people like that. Neoplatonists. For right reason demonstrates the foundation of faith. We can demonstrate that God exists. We can demonstrate that he's infinite. John Stuart Mill is wrong, that he's transcendent. Spinoza is wrong, see? We don't have to just say, well, because I believe in the God of Abraham, Spinoza is wrong. But that's what that's what Pascal was saying. So he's actually doing a disservice, right? I mean, I'm harping on Pascal, but right, there's any number of other people who were in the same boat, including Catholics. For right reason demonstrates the foundations of faith. The foundation, right? Faith builds on reason, just like grace builds on nature. Faith building on reason is one example of grace building on nature. The harmony between grace and nature, as opposed to this opposition between grace and nature that you have certainly in the Protestants. And enlightened by the light of faith, reason cultivates the science of divine things. So we have scientific theology. You see how we have the first two of the three wisdoms here: natural theology, scientific theology. Now it doesn't mention mystical theology, but okay. I guess actually, Ryan, you want to? This is kind of fun to read this. This is the old-fashioned way of talking about. Remember, and there were no anathemas in Vatican II, so there's definitely a shift in kind of how you speak about things. Also, just really the language is much more loose after Vatican II. It's just a different way of approaching things. It's more like a pastoral approach, as they said, because they not wanting to turn people off. Like I said, right? If I could see that if the guy at Trader Joe's, I just avoid calling him ma'am or sir. You know what I mean? I'm not necessarily going to confront him. But so anyway, but this is how they used to say things. Go ahead, Brian.
If anyone shall say that the one true God, our Creator and Lord, cannot be certainly known by the natural light of human reason who created things, let him be anathema.
All right. Meaning condemned, cast out, excluded. You're not Catholic. Kind of like, you don't accept the assumption of Blessed Mother, let him be anathema. You can't do that. You can't disagree with that anymore. It means you don't have the fullness of the faith. Cannot be certainly known. Notice how it's very clear language. Not just, well, you can kind of sort of know that there's something out there. Maybe it's the universe. No, like we can certainly know there is one God who's not finite, etc. by the natural light of human reason, not just the light, because people would say, oh, well, but it's really grace. No, we're talking about just nature. Just our nature is not so corrupt, right? But this is timely because a lot of Catholic intellectuals, they're not necessarily 100% on board with this, right? They're much more kind of going to be on the side of Pascal at the end of the day. Through created things, right? Okay. So it is very clear. Huh?
So with the idea of let him be anathema, so is that like saying, if you don't understand why, let's say, that the one true God, our Creator and Lord, cannot be known by the natural light of human reason, it still requires you to submit your intellect and will, even if you don't yourself understand it, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the whole point, right, of the canon. Yeah. Same way, like you're like, something. I don't really assumption. Come on, or like immaculate conception. Oh, come on, that's just, kind of a saccharine piety. Lords and all this stuff. Saccharine for little children. All right, you can think that, but you still have to accept it. Otherwise, you're not Catholic.
Yeah.
Oh, the Assumption. Oh, come on, turn the Blessed Mother to the fourth person of the Holy Trinity. This is exaggerated. Prior to 1950, you could have said that. I mean, it wouldn't really have been the Catholic spirit, okay, to deny the Assumption.
Yeah.
But you could have kind of thought that.
Okay.
But now you can't think that, right?
Yeah.
In
Because it was
the way you just said it, right? That's the meaning. So when I said not everything in a council is a dogma, like that is a dogma, meaning it's a proposition that's very clear, exactly what it's saying, exactly what it's not saying. Not everything has dogmatic weight. It has to be a very clear proposition. They have a long introduction, and then the leading up to it, and then that's it. Boom, that's the dogma. You have to believe. See, so for example, the Assumption. Do I have to? Is it de fide, right? Is it a dogma that she died or didn't die? Well, you can have your own opinion on it. Now, the encyclical actually favors one to the other. But the point is, it did not make it a dogma. It didn't say, if anyone says that the Blessed Mother did not die before she was assumed, let him be an atheist. See what I mean? So dogma, actually, they're very restricted. That the actual things that are binding, de fide, meaning binding on all the faithful, are actually very kind of narrow. Right? So you could disagree with that. You're like, yeah, you think that she died before she was assumed? You think she wasn't? There's no dogma there. It's not de fide. So there's a more common opinion, as I've mentioned before, like limbo, but you don't have to hold a common opinion. As I was saying with limbo, you can have three opinions, right? Augustine, natural paradise with Aquinas, or the 50-year-old, the newest thing, which is they go to heaven. You're allowed to hold those things. Okay, but is that good? So let's move on then. So that's it for the three wisdoms. That's it for. So all right, proto-philosophical myths. But some of those things come up again. Like we're going to read, Socrates and Aristotle and so on. So this is the.
I was just going to ask, when it comes to analogical versus analogous.
So right. So that's. Remember, I mentioned univocal means. We just saw in logic it refers to one and red.
Right.
Equivocal refers to two things that are unrelated, like the word race. Race as a human population group, or race as a context of speech. They have nothing to do with each other, right? It's just a feature of the English language. In other languages, it doesn't work that way. Raza in Spanish or race in French, they don't mean a context of speech. They just mean a human population group. It's a different word, right? So, analogical is like equivocal. They refer to different natures, but they are related to each other. So the goodness of God and the goodness of a human, the virtue, they are related. So they're not identical like the word red, because then that would be kind of that would be wrong. But they are related, and actually they're related that God's goodness is the cause of all created goodness. So an analogical means that there is a relation, an intrinsic relation between the two. That our goodness is actually intrinsically related to God's goodness, because, right, nothing would exist without God, and therefore nothing could be good without God, right, as a cause of everything that exists in the present, right? God keeps everything it's called preservation. He preserves everything right now, right? It's not just that he created it back then, he also keeps it in existence at every instant. Analogous is an extrinsic relation between the two things. So analogous would be like a metaphor. If you say, I don't know, he's as fast as a horse. You're not saying that he has the nature of a horse, that he has 4 legs and makes a whinnying sound, and has a tail. You're making an extrinsic comparison. Horses run fast, comparatively speaking, and like compared to turtles, and you're saying he's running fast compared to whoever. So that's analogous. It would be it's like a metaphor, basically. Now, just that's my own terminology, but it is kind of, the word analogous is a little bit less strict than the word analogical, but the doctrine is from Aquinas. But just the wording there is kind of my own wording. But so that's why I was saying analogical terms are important, because right? When I say that God is good, okay, and then, Mother Teresa was good, there is a connection there. They're not completely unrelated. So in that sense, it's similar to univocal. There's a similarity of nature, but then there's also a great difference because God's good is infinite, whereas any human good is finite. So in that sense, it's like equivocal because it's like referring to two different things. Now, that's a little nutshell. Maybe the computer can type it out for you. Or the tape, the tape would probably come handy there because, right, I'm just summarizing the chapter that we're going to spend 3 or 4 hours on. So, but since you asked the question, I'm answering the question.
Yes, sir.
So, okay. But yeah, that's where a tape comes in handy because, right, otherwise it'd be hard to write all down. All right, so let's go to page 1, Introduction to Classical Mythology. And so as I put on the definition sheet, right, this is kind of pre-philosophical or proto-philosophical. So obviously, this book is not philosophy, right? It's myths, it's imagination. But it is proto-philosophical in the sense that this is the Greek culture that gave, it gave its origin to philosophy. It's the culture from which philosophy originated. Right? As I said before, you don't have really philosophy in other parts of the world. For just an example, in Japan, there was no word for philosophy. The word for philosophy in Japan was invented in the 1700s because the Jesuits went there and they said there was single philosophy. They had no word for that. They had a word for wisdom, but philosophy is it's something different than just general wisdom, right? So, this is why some people speak about the Greek miracle, that in 5th century Athens, for some reason, all these things happened at once. Basically the foundation of Western civilization as we know it, there were just all these kind of exceptional people like Aeschylus, or people writing plays and sculptures. Right? It's really true. It is pretty incredible if you look at the sculptures that they made, and it's unique. So she's going to speak about that a bit here in the introduction. Okay, let's see who's next. I guess Timothy. It's the first. It doesn't have a page number, but.
Okay, Greek and Roman mythology is quite generally supposed to show us the way the human race thought and left untold ages ago. Through it, according to this view, we can retrace the path from civilized man who lived so far from nature to man who lived in close companionship with nature.
Okay, so I'm going to tell you what she's doing before we keep reading. So what she's doing here is she's aware. So Rousseau. This is a little bit different from, I could actually tie it with this. So I will tie it with this. So what did Luther say? Remember I said the reason typically you talk about Luther when you do the moderns is because he's influencing them, but the way he's influencing them is they're a counter-reaction against him. So Luther said that human nature is totally corrupt, so did Calvin. So that's now just a reality in Europe, right? This is the great tragedy of the so-called Reformation. So this is odd intra language or odd extra language. So odd intra language, I wouldn't call it a Reformation because Reformation means reform. Were Luther and Calvin reforming the church and making it better? No. It's funny you guys put that in your little essay, right? Or someone mentioned that. Rebellion. No, it was a rebellion. It was a revolt. It was an uprising, right? Jesus Christ said to St. Peter, "You are a rock, and on this rock I will build my church." We didn't invent the papacy. That's not. It's not that we Catholics feel like we need to control everything, so we invented a pope. But he said to him, he said that, "I give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven." And he went on and on with it. Whatever you bind on earth is bound in heaven. It's a crystal clear statement. And they revolted against the authority that Jesus Christ established. You see, it's completely and anti-scriptural, right? So that's why it's a revolt. So amongst us, I always call it the Protestant revolt, or I will never use the word Reformation because that's what they say it was. That's their narrative. Their narrative. Oh, the church was in need of reform. There was so much corruption. We reformed it. We reformed it by getting rid of the sacraments, getting rid of the saints, getting rid of stained glass windows, getting rid by obliterating it, right? Most of it. So that's not actually a reform, right? That's a destructive process. And then modern philosophy also is a destructive process. But in a sense, what opened the door to it was the destructive process of Catholicism. After the destructive process of Catholicism, of the Protestant revolt, then there was now against faith. Then after that, within 100 years, there was a destructive process against reason. But can you see how one opened the door to the other? Some of you guys mentioned, right, in little essays, like subjectivism took place in Christianity with Luther before it took place with Descartes. So do you see how there's a continuity there? Which is something that historians of history of ideas talks about that, right? That you don't have to be Catholic to see that continuity, right? You could be a complete atheist and still see, yeah, sure, Luther opened the door to subjectivism, right? I mean, obviously, it's an individual believer with individual text, and I decide what the Bible means, right? That's the essence of Protestantism. So in a sense, each man is his own pope, right, with Protestantism. So once again, you can't write it all down. This is what it takes. So every once in a while, I got to speed up and throw in a whole bunch of stuff at once. That's what tape comes in. Unlike just reading the text. But so anyway, so the counter reaction. So anyway, ad intra language is, so amongst us, I'm going to say Protestant rebellion. If I'm invited to an ecumenical gathering, I'm not going to call it the Protestant revolt. I'm not going to say what I just said. That's not the way to build bridges, right? So there is such a thing as being pastoral, right? Like I'm not going to start a fight with the guy at Trader Joe's. Maybe there's a little part of me that wants to, but you see, no, Jesus said, "Learn from me, I am meek and humble of heart," right? So that's what we have to do. Can't be like the firebrands. So the ad intra language here in the, just in this little entre nous, as they say in French, among us, is the Protestant revolt. But then, when I go to the ecumenical gathering, of course, I'll just say, well, since the beginning of Protestantism, this view has been all. But I still won't say Reformation, because it's not a Reformation. I don't want to, right? If you give them the language, like who controls the language? What we saw earlier, right? Controls the thought. Who controls the thought? Controls reality. That's why I when someone asked me about this, like what they see on the news or what they see on TV, I immediately went to St. Anthony of Claret against the newspapers, because they want to change the language, because then they change the thought and they change the social reality, right? So, okay, so that's, anyway, so that's the Protestant revolt is, see what I'm saying, right? I'm not saying you should use that when you go visit your Protestant relatives, or whatever, But that's what we're calling it, because right, you're using objective language just for this context. Right, so it was all based on this idea of total corruption. So then there was a counter reaction against that, because right, one extreme always kind of elicits the other extreme, right? If someone is pushing you really hard, the natural thing is to push back. So the moderns are going to push back. So Rousseau basically says, not only are we not totally corrupt, like that's just, think about it, you think about how horrible that is. Like everything you do is a mortal sin, unless you're, so anyone who's not Christian, everything they do is evil. And then, you could just look at people, like, I don't know, now they're starting to go to Asia, they're discovering Asia, right? Before, it wasn't even on their radar, like when they talked about humanity. Like Asia, whatever, Marco Polo or something, maybe there's a couple people out there. Then now they're actually going, they're like, oh my gosh, there's like millions and millions of people who aren't Christian. And like, is everything they do evil? It doesn't look like it. Actually, they seem to be kind of nice, right? So, actually, they seem to be kind of civilized. Like, so the point is, so see what I mean? You said you could then say, well, this is a bunch of nonsense. And so, but then you could go to the opposite extreme. So for him, we're not totally corrupt, but human nature is totally innocent. And so this is the whole conversation that Rousseau and Hobbes and all these other ones are going to have about the state of nature. And when they talk about the state of nature now, they're nominalists, so they don't really believe in human nature. But still, the state of nature is total innocence. At our core, we're completely innocent. Do you see how it's the total opposite? And that's regarding the state of nature. So what that means is that, in a primitive situation, that what he's going to say, now actually against the evidence, because right, Asia is not primitive. Asia already had civilization for 1,000 years, but like China and so on. But like in America, they really are primitive, and actually it was not pretty. If you know about the Iroquois, read about the North American martyrs, it was very ugly, and it really was actually quite diabolical. Read about how they treated Isaac Jogues and Jean de Brebeuf and the Jesuit martyrs. And they're the ones that are canonized, right? There's always the people who were treated like that and weren't canonized because, right, there was no investigation or whatever. But so really what he's saying is going completely against what's true and what's known about North America. But he doesn't care, he just doesn't know. Because he's an ideologue, all right? But so that Rousseauian ideology of the state of nature as one of complete innocence, that's kind of what she's criticizing here. She's criticizing the idea that, well, people are basically, from a Rousseauian perspective, people are like, well, the Greeks are fine, but really, if we went back to the primitive society, that's where everything is innocent, and, everyone was good, and everyone was peaceful. Right? This is the Rousseauian ideology that also has influenced as a anthropology and things like that. So anyway, see, that's what she's not going to mention Rousseau. She's not a philosopher, but in the background here, that's what she's talking about. Because she's going to say they had a connection to nature unlike anything we ourselves can feel. Well, to some degree that's true, but if you look at the Iroquois, your main concern was not your connection with nature. Your main concern was not getting a hatchet in your head if you ran into someone or getting scalped if you ran into someone from the opposite tribe, because they were living in a state of perpetual war. And the Iroquois, actually, if you read the Jesuit Relations, which is a book about the Jesuits were very meticulous, sending back letters about what was going on, and the Iroquois were basically perpetrating genocide against the Hurons. That they were going to kill the Hurons until not a single Huron was left, until the only tribe in Northeast America, from a huge area, parts of Canada all the way to the Great Lakes, was Iroquois, and every single Huron was dead. Right? That's what was going on when the Jesuits arrived. So see, not only is it not this kind of peaceful, innocent utopia, right? For him, the state of nature is a utopia, right? It's utter peace and innocence and harmony, and right, you don't have to work because everything's just there for you. Complete opposite of the truth about what was discovered in North America, where it was hard to survive, people didn't starve to death and stuff. The Jesuits talk about it in the Jesuit Relations. Talk about, half the tribe died that winter because, they couldn't catch any moose, and so that kind of thing. So see, but that's the ideology. So then that ideology has, as I said, influenced things like ethnology, includes writing about myths, and so people who write about these things will kind of perpetuate that narrative, and that's what she's arguing against, even though she's not mentioning it. Okay.
When the stories
Good.
When the stories were being shaped, we are given to understand little distinction had as yet been made between the real and the unreal. The imagination was vividly alive and not checked by the reason.
Right, so it seems using reason in a negative sense. Okay, this is the romantic approach, which Rousseau is very much a romantic, and you can see that. Okay.
So that anyone in the woods might see through the trees a fleeing nymph, or bending over a clear pool to drink, behold the depths a naiad's face.
So a nymph is the naiad is like a water spirit, the nymph is I think it's a similar kind of thing, some kind of spirit. It's like a feminine form, not as high as the gods who are higher. Okay, why don't you skip where it says, but a very brief.
But a very brief consideration of the ways of uncivilized peoples everywhere and in all ages is enough to prick that romantic bubble.
And where I was telling you he's a romantic, right? That romantic kind of sentimentalist, utopian, everyone's really good deep down, no one's actually bad. Okay.
Nothing is clearer than the fact that primitive man, whether in New Guinea today or eons ago in the prehistoric wilderness, is not and never has been a creature who peoples his world with bright fancies and lovely visions.
So the New Guinea reference, that's actually kind of interesting. You may not have, like I said, I took that class in anthropology, that's where I learned about this. This was written in 1942. Something like in the 1920s in Papua New Guinea, which is a big island, from the shore it just looks like a bunch of mountains. And then it wasn't until the 1920s that someone actually explored it, right? Parts of the world still were not explored, they hadn't sent planes up there, and they went up there and there were millions of people living up there. So in the 1920s, there were millions of people living, it turned out it was a big plateau, and they were completely untouched by civilization. They had never met anyone from from civilization or from the modern world. And so it was kind of fascinating because you could see how they were living, like just, right? Like it'd be like, basically like traveling back in time, right? And they had a system of constant warfare. It was like symbolic warfare. So because they were always fighting with each other, they decided to make it symbolic to where, so they wouldn't just slaughter all each other. So it was kind of an intelligent way of handling that problem. Because in other parts, like in the Amazon jungle, once again, like what would happen, they would just be constantly slaughtering each other, like by the dozens or hundreds. So really what you actually observe in most primitive societies is constant warfare and battles. That's a polar opposite of Rousseau. So she's kind of making that point that if people want to say, well, you know, what was best was the primitive situation. She's saying, no, like the Greeks have moved a long way beyond that, and civilization is superior. But against Rousseau, you basically need to defend just the fact of civilization. And then also you need to defend Western civilization, because he also looked down on Western civilization, looked down on Christianity. So that influenced the postmoderns very much, right? So from Rousseau, postmoderns over here, but he is very influential on the postmoderns. So not the Enlightenment, but what came after that. Okay.
Horrors lurked in the primeval forest, not nymphs and naiads. Terror lived there with its close attendant magic, and its most common defense, human sacrifice. Mankind's chief hope of escaping the wrath of whatever divinities within abroad lay in some magical rite, senseless but powerful, or in some offering made at the cost of pain and grief.
I mean, there's reams of, anthropology that have been written on this. So like Northern Europe, they just called all them, it was all known as the Celts. That's what the Greeks called it. So anything Northern Europe was the Celts. There was no like England, I don't know, it was just all the Celts, the Celtoi. And, the religion that they practiced often had the Druids, and, it's centered around human sacrifice. Now, not on a grand scale like the Aztecs, but still, like, that there was yearly human sacrifices, right, to just keep the crops going, keep the weather good, and that's how it was. And right, some offering made at the cost of pain and grief. So yearly, that's how the Celts lived. So that's why they were the barbarians, right? Like our ancestors, as opposed to the Greeks, were the barbarians, and the Greeks were aware that they were more civilized. That it was civilized not to. So even though as Christians we're going to see all the bad things about, Greeks and Romans, which are true. I mean, there were a lot of bad things, but compared to the barbarians, they still had made a lot of progress. Okay, who's next? Sure.
This dark picture is worlds apart from the stories of classical mythology. The study of the way early man looked at his surroundings does not get much help from the Greeks. How briefly the anthropologists treat the Greek myths is noteworthy. Of course, the Greeks too had their roots in primeval slime. Of course, they too once lived a savage life, ugly and brutal. But what the myths show is how high they have risen above the ancient filth and fierceness by the time we have any knowledge of them. Only a few traces of that time are to be found in the stories.
This is where if you know some of this, so for example, in the Iliad and the Odyssey are the beginning of Greek literature. That's the first written text that we have. It says, right, there's Iphigenia, so, see, I did classics, that's part of why I know a lot of stuff when I was in college. But, so Agamemnon, in order, the winds are unfavorable to the fleet leaving to go to Troy. And so one of the priests says, well, you have to sacrifice your daughter so that, I don't know, whoever, Apollo will give you good winds. So he doesn't want to, but he sacrifices his daughter, right? They might think, oh, well, maybe that's not historical, maybe that's symbolic. Well, no, it's a leftover of the human sacrifice. She's saying human sacrifice is the norm in a barbarian situation. And so, like talking about the Celts as I did. So, that's the leftover of human sacrifice in leading. The Trojan War is what, like 1000 BC or something like that? So there was still a vestige of human sacrifice left. But of course, by the time you get to what's called classical Greece, which is like the time of Plato and Aristotle or the Pre-Socratics, like 600 BC, there's no more human sacrifice anymore. But at the time of the Trojan War, you can see it still happening because occasionally it mentions it happening. Okay? All right, so let's go. We're up to page 3. So we'll keep reading the introduction because I think she does a good job of, presenting it. And we'll read a couple excerpts from the rest of the book. And then we'll basically just have a discussion about, so think about that, like how do the Greeks present the deities, right? And put their God's positive and negative characteristics in the Greek myths. So for that, when you're reading it, think about what are positive and negative characteristics of the deities, right? And then I'll put them on the board, okay, when we get to the discussion part. So maybe you take notes on that when you're reading it. For both the male and female deities, what are positive and negative about each of them? Okay? The Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Glory to the Father and to the Son and to the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and will be forever. Amen.